Good morning, Metalheads Internet. Welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown, and today we're looking at the latest studio album from Mayhem entitled Daemon. Or perhaps it's pronounced Demon, I'm not entirely sure, but fuck it, that's not really the important part. This is the sixth studio album from the highly controversial but nonetheless legendary Norwegian black metal band Mayhem, who are arguably the first true black metal band, period. Sure, we definitely had bands like Venom, Merciful Fate, Bathory, Celtic Frost, all laying down a lot of elements that would define black metal, but as far as the traditional black metal sound is concerned, Mayhem is the quintessential band. Their debut album, De Mysteriis Dom Satanas, is a landmark record of black metal, and for that matter, the entire extreme music spectrum. And while some of their other records since then have been hit and miss among the fan base, I have personally enjoyed the more experimental flavors found on some of these records, including the somewhat controversial Grand Declaration of War, as well as their most recent record, Esoteric Warfare. And that brings us to this new record, Daemon, which is actually a very special record for a lot of reasons. For one, this is the first time there hasn't been a lineup change in between records, so that's really cool. We're finally getting a full band building off of previous successes and really building a tight sound. This is also a much more traditional, old-school Norwegian black metal record in comparison to their more experimental flavors, something that longtime fans will be excited about. And finally, it's also an interesting record because this is their first album in a post-Lords of Chaos world. I'm well aware that simply saying that movie's name is enough to infuriate black metal fans worldwide, but here's the thing. It doesn't matter if you think it's cringeworthy. It doesn't matter if you think that the existence of Lords of Chaos is somehow the equivalent to black metal literally selling its heart and soul away. Because Lords of Chaos, regardless of how you feel, has given Mayhem the opportunity to force themselves into the spotlight, as it has exposed them and the black metal genre to a much wider audience than anyone could have anticipated. A much wider audience than Death Heaven or Behemoth could have ensnared, for that matter. Which in theory, I think would inspire a band like Mayhem not just to make a solid black metal record, but to make a definitive black metal record. A record that showcases everything terrifying and wonderful about this highly controversial genre. And to a certain extent, they do succeed on this record, Daemon. It is everything that I think people have been wanting for a Mayhem record since the band's debut. The tremolo riffs, the atmospheric vocals, the hellish soundscapes, the trimming away of anything semi-experimental and progressive. Simply put, a hot fucking slab of pure traditional Norwegian black metal. One that fans, I'm sure, are going to absolutely love, if for that matter they aren't already. Even someone like myself, who isn't a huge fan of this hyper-conservative, ultra-traditional black metal, was able to find a lot of things to enjoy in this record. Take, for instance, the incredible hellish sound that cloaks every second of this record. Even in the album's most generic and uninspired black metal moments, it still sounds so large, so demonic, so fucking evil. Take, for instance, a track like Bad Blood, which even by the standards of this record is a pretty simplistic number with some drawling guitar passages and some pretty typical black metal performances, but it's elevated by a very subtle choir that pops in and out of the forefront of the sound, and near the very end of the track, it just unleashes on this almost Kerry King-esque assault of wailing, winding guitar solos elevated by those choirs and some really great rhythm parts. Or for that matter, the immediate blast of icy Norwegian wind on the dying False King. It opens the album on such an immediate and important note. It doesn't waste your time on these little intros. It doesn't waste your time on a 2-minute piece of guitars and pianos and strings. It just launches head first into a vicious, pummeling assault of extreme metal madness. And while I am still somewhat unhappy to see that Daemon has stripped the band of the experimental songwriting that they've implemented in previous records, I am happy to see that the lessons they've learned from those records are reflected on this record. Take, for instance, a track like Aeon Dominium, a particularly ominous cut which opens on some mid-paced drawls and some incredibly haunting vocals. Over the course of 6 minutes, it consistently builds on these mid-pace riffs and eventually gets a little faster, introduces some more choirs, some more synths, some more hellish guitar work, some more abrasive vocals, and by the end of it feels like this incredibly explosive and even cinematic avalanche of pure Norwegian black metal. A very similar approach is used in another track, Daemon Spawn, but here Mayhem implements a lot of very oddly timed drum patterns that feel very tribal and unorthodox, and it immediately gives this song a much more uneasy feel, and it makes it feel all the more cathartic when it does launch into its black metal manicy. Performances are great across the record. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that as a unit, Mayhem have not sounded this professional, this tightly bound, really ever. Really, the only issue I have is that despite the enthusiasm, despite the fire, despite the energy that is consistently on display 100% throughout the record, it's not quite enough to distract me from some of the more generic black metal songwriting tropes and stereotypes. I'm more than willing to chalk that up to personal bias, mind you. I am on record as saying that I'm not a huge fan of the traditional black metal sound. I am also on record as saying that I prefer the more modern, experimental, and progressive sounds of bands such as Enslaved, Mirror, Death Heaven, Ghost Bath, Panopticon, the more adventurous songwriting from other bands, as well as modern records from Behemoth that I thought were really artistically expansive and engaging. And as a result, I am always inherently looking for something more exciting and ambitious out of my black metal, and therefore something that sticks so closely to the core roots of the genre just doesn't interest me. But that being said, I still got a lot out of this record, and most importantly, the Mayhem diehard fans, the black metal nuts, are going to go apeshit over this. So I'm going to give this an enthusiastic 3 out of 5. Ultimately, this is probably not a record I will come back to, but as far as the traditional black metal sound is concerned, this is probably the most I've enjoyed it in some time. In this record's best moments, it really does display everything that makes this genre so important and inspiring to so many people worldwide. And even in its worst moments, it doesn't ever dip to anything really that boring or insulting or anything like that. It's still ultimately a pretty competent, if somewhat average record at the core. I'd be very curious to hear how people who maybe heard about Mayhem through Lords of Chaos have to say about this record. I'd be very curious to see how they feel about Mayhem coming out of that experience. With that in mind, I'd be very curious to hear from someone who had maybe never listened to black metal before, or at the very least is not exposed to this traditional style in comparison to the styles of a lot of the bands we just talked about. But as I've noted, what they have to say really doesn't matter. This is really ultimately an album for the fans, and I would be extremely shocked if Mayhem diehard fans did not eat this up as if it was the most delicious fucking meal they've ever had. So once again, I'd give this an enthusiastic 3 out of 5, a record that ultimately wasn't made for me, but that's not a bad thing, because Mayhem know who they're catering to by now. Mayhem know who they're making records for by now. I think that this is something that true diehard Mayhem fans have been waiting for, and I think to some extent Mayhem is aware of that. Good for them, good for everyone involved. I hope they have a fucking ball with this if they aren't already. And that is it! And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be. So what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? Thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe to get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.